to announce yet another military engagement. Again, we're watching that podium there because we're expecting the moment, the president here at any moment. Courtney Kuby is going to be standing by for us at the Pentagon. She's been there all this evening, waiting for the latest briefings. We're also, I mean, you hear from the president on nights like this. You also hear from military experts. In terms of in the region and on the ground reporting, we expect to be hearing from Richard Engel, who is in Istanbul. Turkey, of course, is an important player here that almost never gets discussed when we're talking about Assad and his allies. But Turkey and Iran and Russia are key allies for the Assad regime. ITN, the British news service, has reported tonight that British jets have taken off from Cyprus. We don't know where they were headed, but with the time difference, it's 7 hours ahead between now and Syria. That means that we're roughly 4 a.m. in Syria right now. If British jets are taking off from Cyprus, there is speculation that this may be some sort of event that involves not just American military power, but also our allies. I'm told that we are less than a minute out now from the president's remarks. We don't know how long these remarks are expected to be. We are expecting that these remarks are only going to be about a military strike in Syria. If you've been following the news today, you know that there is a lot of news today, particularly news involving the scandal that surrounds the president, the Russia investigation, and a newly announced criminal investigation into his lawyer. But the president's going to address us live from the White House right now.
Fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. The United States responded with 58 missile strikes that destroyed 20% of the Syrian Air Force. Last Saturday, the Assad regime again deployed chemical weapons to slaughter innocent civilians, this time in the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. Following the horrors of World War I a century ago, civilized nations joined together to ban chemical warfare. Chemical weapons are uniquely dangerous, not only because they inflict gruesome suffering, but because even small amounts can unleash widespread devastation. The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States. The combined American, British, and French response to these atrocities will integrate all instruments of our national power, military, economic, and diplomatic. We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents. I also have a message tonight for the two governments most responsible for supporting, equipping, and financing the criminal Assad regime. To Iran and to Russia, I ask, what kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators. In 2013, President Putin and his government promised the world that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. Assad's recent attack and today's response are the direct result of Russia's failure to keep that promise. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join with civilized nations as a force for stability and peace. Hopefully, someday we'll get along with Russia and maybe even Iran, but maybe not. I will say this, the United States has a lot to offer. With the greatest and most powerful economy in the history of the world. In Syria, the United States, with but a small force being used to eliminate what is left of ISIS, is doing what is necessary to protect the American people. Over the last year, nearly 100% of the territory once controlled by the so-called ISIS caliphate.
Remarks. And you know this. This is a president whose rhetoric has not always been as tough as some of his critics have wanted to see on Russia. Tonight, he issued a warning to Vladimir Putin and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, don't go down that dark road. So really putting Putin on notice, and that, I think, is one of the big storylines that we're going to have to be watching over the next 48 hours as this unfolds. It's
what you're talking about there in terms of the whipsawing around on the messaging here. I mean, I think it can't be sort of we shouldn't understate it. As recently as last week, the president is reported to have erupted in a Situation Room meeting, saying that not only did he want all U.S. troops out of Syria, he wanted them out within 48 hours, which is something that probably logistically wouldn't even be possible if he had a magic wand. Then that's followed immediately by the new hawkish National Security Advisor, John Bolton, coming in. We get on the anniversary of U.S. missile strikes in Syria. We then get another chemical attack in Syria. The president then says, get ready, Russia. The missiles are coming. The White House aides then told reporters they were shocked and alarmed by those comments. There was no decision made at that point that there was going to be a strike. There was no negotiations. Negotiations had not been completed with our allies like the UK and France that those things were going to happen. The Wall Street Journal reporting as recently as this evening that there was incredible differences of opinion between the president and his defense secretary. So there has been I feel like it's whipsawing, but it's gone back and forth and back again in terms of what to expect here. Hallie, I have to ask you about, because of that in particular, I have to ask you about whether there have been there's been sort of appreciation of the sensitivities that the country might feel about this decision, given the other news that's been breaking around the president. I mean, the federal prosecutors in New York confirmed today that the president's longtime personal lawyer is under criminal investigation. Just a couple of hours ago, McClatchy News Service reported that a key element of the Christopher Steele Russia dossier that relates to the president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, is something that Robert Mueller's investigators have received evidence to support. The president has been absolutely off the hook, upset at the FBI and the Russia investigation, in particular over the last couple of days with James Comey now doing his first interview about his new book, which accuses the president of all sorts of things. Are they sensitive to the perception that the president may be making this announcement to distract from his woes?
So a couple of interesting points that you bring up there, Rachel. To the sensitivity aspect of it, I haven't had a chance to sort of run back in and talk to folks inside. I imagine that if anything, they would take umbrage to that assumption, as one might predict that they would, given that they would point to sort of the national security pieces to this and what's at play here. I will say, just to give you a sense, though, of everything that is happening, the avalanche of news, as we are literally sitting here having this conversation about the potential and about the military action that the president is now taking in Syria, I heard from Michael Cohen's lawyer talk about juggling stories. And there was that report that I think you referenced earlier from McClatchy indicating that Michael Cohen perhaps had, in fact, traveled to Prague during the 2016 campaign. It's something that he had vociferously denied back when that was first revealed, and something that, according to McClatchy, the special counsel is looking at and has evidence of happening. Cohen's lawyer just heard from him saying that is definitively not true, that report is not true. Telling you first, haven't even had a chance to send a note to our NBC News team, Rachel, but I share that with you because this is the moment in time that we are in, where you have a president who is taking, not just contemplating now, but taking significant military action overseas. At the same time, by our reporting, incredibly frustrated, furious with Rod Rosenstein, with Robert Mueller, with the special counsel investigation, angry at the raid of his longtime lawyer's home, somebody who is now under investigation after having been in his circle for decades, and at the same time looking ahead next week to a talk with the Prime Minister of Japan about meeting with North Korea, Rachel. So a lot's happening, to say the least.
I'll put your note in the system if you want me.
Thank you.
I will do. Hallie Jackson, NBC News White House correspondent. Much appreciated, Hallie. I should tell you, while I've been talking about lots of things happening at once, Ayman Mouldine, who's an incredible reporter who's here with us now at NBC, has just reported that Syrian state television has broken into programming. It's about 4:30 in the morning in Syria right now. They're about 7 hours ahead. They are 7 hours ahead of the East Coast time in the United States. Syrian state TV has broken into programming and is now reporting that Syrian air defense forces have launched counterstrikes against the, quote, American, French, and British aggression on Syria. Syria does have relatively advanced air defense systems. We had been expecting that if there were manned aircraft rather than missiles or drones that were involved in a significant air attack in Syria tonight or at any time, that Syrian air defenses would have to be part of the calculus in terms of how the attack would be structured, what the first targets would be, and what the overall expectations could be for what could be hit effectively. Joining us now for more on that and the rest of this news is Colonel Jack Jacobs, MSNBC military analyst, Medal of Honor recipient. Colonel Jack, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for being with us tonight. Let me ask you about that air defense force factor. How serious are Syrian air defenses, and how much would that have to factor in to planning for this strike tonight?
Well, they're not insubstantial, but we're probably launching missiles, both sea-launched cruise missiles and air-launched cruise missiles launched from B-52s some distance away, 1,000 miles away, perhaps. Missiles are extremely difficult to shoot down. We're not very good at it, and the Syrians are even less good at it. You can occasionally knock one down, but they're extremely difficult to knock down. But what it sounds like, that announcement that says counterstrikes sounds less like air defenses. A counterstrike usually means a strike on the enemy's positions. Now, it'd be extremely difficult for them to strike our ships. They're very heavily protected. But what they could do is to fly in zones where we have American troops or American allies like the Kurds. That's entirely possible. But it sounds more like bluster. It's very, very difficult to shoot down an incoming missile, Rachel.
And Colonel Jack, we had an initial report very quickly after the president's remarks concluded, a report from Reuters, which said that explosions could be heard on the eastern side of Damascus. Damascus, obviously the most populous city in Syria, and an urban area, even a densely populated area, despite the absolute value of its population. Are you surprised to hear that Damascus, at least from this initial report, might be one of the targets? Would you have expected the targeting here to be more far-flung military locations?
Well, if the objective is to knock out some of their capability, either their stores of chemicals, which is, I don't think we're interested in doing that because it would just disperse them, and that would be much more dangerous to the population, or to their delivery means, which are typically helicopters. You might expect there to be helicopter locations, bases near populated areas, and particularly around Damascus. So my guess is they're attacking delivery means rather than the stores themselves. And we have a pretty good way of tracking exactly where the assets are. Meanwhile, in the interim, when we first started talking about the fact that we were going to attack, when the president says, well, the missiles are coming and so on, the Russians have been moving their assets, including aircraft, to safe locations. And my guess, one of the reasons we've waited is so so that the Russians would have an opportunity to move their stuff away. But probably air bases near Damascus and helicopters in particular.
When the president used the word sustained to talk about this response, did that say anything to you about the scope of this campaign or how long it might last?
Yeah, we've been talking about that for some time in discussions with other people who've been looking at it, come to the same conclusion. You remember back in April when we launched the attacks with the 59 cruise missiles, that was a one-shot deal. It was pretty much toward one target. And Trump telegraphed what he was going to do a couple of days ago when he was discussing it in public. What you're probably going to have here are several days' worth of attacks and multiple targets that we've picked out, that the Defense Department has picked out as the most likely targets for us to use. So more likely to be not a one-shot deal like it was in April, but a couple of, not a sustained attack, but a couple of days worth of attacks.
Colonel Jack, I have one last question for you. And if you do not want to answer this question, you absolutely do not have to, and you can just say goodnight. But I'm wondering, when decisions like this are made, obviously, this gas attack that these strikes are a response to happened last week. The president said early in the week that the missiles were coming, get ready, Russia. We've been expecting, you know, here at NBC News, we've been standing by all week long, every night, thinking about when these things might happen. They have been launched tonight. When these decisions are made about both the goal and the timing, are there considerations given to the perceived motivations of the president? Obviously, when the United States takes a military action like this, the rest of the world takes notice, both in terms of the actual damage done, but also what it signals in terms of American resolve and what America might do next. If the president might be perceived to have a wag the dog problem, if the president is in the midst of an increasingly consuming domestic scandal that's getting very, very close to him personally, is that factored in as a military strategic matter in terms of how a military action ordered under those circumstances might be perceived both by our enemies and by our allies?
Well, I think the president uses it surely when he makes a decision. And I think that in observations from afar, from our allies and our enemies from some distance, there's a certain measure of that is perceived. But I think one of the reasons why it's taken so long, I mean, there are a couple of reasons why it's taken so long. And one of them, I think, I mean, the timing is clearly, I don't believe in coincidences, but the timing is clearly a coincidence given what's been emanating in the domestic front. But I think our government has had a hard time getting our allies on board. That's taken some time. I think also that there has been a great deal of discussion inside the White House and between the White House and the Defense Department about whether or not there ought to be retaliation and punishment and what form it should take, and that's taken time too. At the end of the day, I'm not a fan of single-factor analysis. I think all these things are important, and you can't discount the wag the dog factor in this particular case any more than you can discount any other factor. I think they all pile on to produce exactly what we see now and the timing that we see now, Rachel.
Colonel Jack Jacobs, NBC military analyst, thank you so much for being with us tonight, sir. Invaluable to have you here. Thank you. We're now going to go to Moscow. NBC News foreign correspondent Keir Simmons is up in the middle of the night for us in Moscow. Keir, thank you very much for joining us tonight. These strikes have been announced by the president in conjunction with the UK and France. Obviously, Assad's greatest allies in Syria are Iran and Russia, and the Russia factor here cuts a lot of different directions. What can you tell us about the response tonight in Moscow?
Well, I was interested to hear there, Rachel, you reporting Syrian television saying that Syrian air defenses are engaging, I think you said, against these strikes. by the US, Britain and France. That's interesting. There are two forms of air defenses in Syria, S-300, S-400. They are all Russian, but one group of the air defenses are manned by Syrians. The other air defenses are manned by Russians. Those Russian air defenses are ostensibly there to protect the Russians who are in the country. And one of the questions here in Moscow in the build-up to this has been whether the Russian air defenses would engage. It sounds as if, from that reporting from Syrian television, perhaps they are not. We have been texting multiple and trying to contact multiple Russian government officials here in Moscow. As you say, it is 4 in the morning. We haven't heard back from them, perhaps understandably. I did have one message from an official at the Russian Foreign Ministry saying the question, of course, we are asking each of them is, were the Russians given advance notice of these strikes? The message back from one Foreign Ministry official saying, we'll soon find out. So that slightly kind of dark Russian sense of humour there doesn't tell us necessarily whether that kind of communication has taken place. We were told in the build-up to this that there were communications between the Russian military and between the Western military to try to avoid Russian casualties, because that clearly would be one of the concerns. Our understanding from the Russian Foreign Ministry is that there are 8,500 Russian civilians in Syria, and according to polling returns from the recent Russian elections, government officials say that there are just under 3,000 members of the Russian military there. They said that because, of course, they were saying how many members of the Russian military had voted in those elections. So that gives you a picture of the issues here. We assume, and I think we safely assume, that there is a good deal of work underway to ensure that Russians are not casualties of this strike, because, of course, the real concern, or a real concern, would be that that would lead to an escalation.
And in terms of that prospect, obviously that is something that sets not just our teeth on edge, but people all over the world because of the capabilities of the Russian military and the American military. With the Russians having such a significant military presence in Syria, with reports earlier this week that some Syrian assets may have been moved to Russian-controlled bases in Syria, essentially to get them out of harm's way. Do you have any clear sense, Keir, from your reporting about what the Russian response would be, what they would do next if Russian assets are targeted or if Russian troops or indeed civilians are harmed?
That's the question that I've been asking Russian officials for the past few days, as you would expect. I think that the message that we heard from the Russian ambassador to Lebanon suggesting that Russia would strike back at US missiles, that even Russia would target the source of those missiles. I think that was overblown. After those comments, I spoke to a number of Russian officials, both in the Kremlin and in the foreign ministry, to see, and they wouldn't repeat that kind of warning, although at the same time, of course, warning very much that there could be an escalation depending on what kind of strikes these are, and most importantly, as I was mentioning, whether Russian targets are involved. And it does create that kind of military chess game, is the kind of thing you're describing there, which is, of course, I don't think we know for sure, but it wouldn't be surprising at all, and you would expect that the Syrians would be moving their assets closer to the Russian assets in order to protect them, knowing that the US would be wanting to, not be wanting to target Russian assets within Syria. And then the wider question, Rachel, that the Russians have been bringing up over the past few days, most recently Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday has been there warning that this could escalate, and Foreign Minister Lavrov saying quite specifically, referring to history, saying, God forbid this turns into an intervention like Libya or the Iraq experience. The Russians, take Iraq, for example, this is the kind of argument they make here. The Russians very strongly argued against intervention in Iraq. President Putin has consistently said since then that it was a mistake and criticised the West for it. And that is some of the reasoning that they bring to arguing that an intervention like this should not happen.
Keir Simmons joining us from Moscow tonight and staying up till past dark to do it. Thank you, Keir. Much appreciated to have you with us this evening. I want to now cross the region a little bit and go to Richard Engel, who's NBC News' chief foreign correspondent and a dear friend to this show. Richard is in Istanbul tonight covering this, both in terms of what we know about the scope of the strike and the reaction in the region. Richard, my friend, thank you very much for being with us. What can you tell us about your reporting thus far this evening?
Absolutely, Rachel. We are still trying to figure out exactly what is being hit. There are reports of at least 2 locations on the outskirts of Damascus that have been targeted. Unclear exactly what they are. One is reportedly associated with the Syrian National Guard on a regime place, but all the attacks not exactly in Damascus center, but around Damascus. Also, reports of explosions in eastern Syria, 2 different locations in eastern Syria. But what struck me listening to President Trump is that this isn't designed or wasn't explained to be a one-off operation. He said this is an open-ended commitment that the U.S. is prepared to continue these operations until Bashar al-Assad stops using chemical weapons. That is, if not a new war in the Middle East, it is certainly a new open-ended mission, and it is one that carries significant risks. Already, Syrian air defenses, according to Syrian state TV, according to some video posted on social media that I was just looking at, Syrian air defenses are in action. Syrian state TV broke into its coverage, and it is now about 4:30 in the morning in Damascus, to tell who is ever watching that Syrian air defenses are in action, launching counterstrikes against what it described as the U.S., French, and British aggression. I've been told by U.S. Officials that there were great efforts made to try and communicate with the Russians, that this was not in any way, shape, or form a coordinated operation with the Russians, that the Russians weren't happy with it, continue to oppose it, but that they were informed clearly about U.S. intentions. That's easy to do on day 1 of an operation. But President Trump said this is an open-ended operation. So we will see what happens as this continues into day 2, day 3. Will there be a pause? Will there be an assessment? Was that an empty threat? But it is certainly a major commitment to say the U.S. will respond every time there is a report of chemical weapons. Nikki Haley today said at the UN there have been 50 uses of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime in the last 5 years or so. So does that mean the U.S. is going to respond in that kind of scale?
Richard, let me also ask you, with what you're talking about there, obviously we know about the admitted Russian military presence on the ground in Syria. Syria has been a long-term beachhead for Russia in the Middle East. We also know about irregular Russian forces, essentially mercenary or contract forces from Russia that are playing a role in the Syrian conflict. We also know less about, but we know about the existence of Iranian forces being involved on the ground in Russia, both the Russian forces and Iranian forces in support of the Assad regime. Is there a worry about American intelligence, American understanding about who we might end up engaging with, about where those forces are, about having clarity as to who we might be engaging with, if indeed, as you say, these strikes appear to be happening in multiple places and they appear to be scheduled to go on in an indefinite fashion?
There absolutely should be concern, and I'm sure there is, about the intelligence picture in Syria. It is the most complex civil war that I've covered in the last 20 years covering the Middle East. You have uniformed Russian troops who are there helping the Syrian regime. It's not exactly clear where all those troops are based. The Russians certainly aren't telling their American counterparts where they are. Then there are these unofficial Russian mercenaries that I was with American commanders in Syria not very long ago, and they were describing a firefight that they got in with some of these Russian mercenaries, and they ended up killing between 200 and 300 of them on the ground. And they felt that they were being lied to by the Russians, that the Russians were telling them one story and then not necessarily giving them all the facts and then trying to cover their traces. And this is with the Russians. With the Iranians, there is even less communication because the Iranian advisors on the ground are much less formal. It is more of an intelligence relationship where they have influencers. They are working with different militia groups, working with Iraqi militia groups that are there to help them. So it is an absolute mess. And on day one, it is easier to communicate. There had been a buildup. People knew more or less that a strike was coming in this period. President Trump tweeted it out. He said, a strike is coming. Get ready, get ready. So you can more or less be precise on day one. And the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians can take precautions. But if this is supposed to be continuing until the Syrians decide they're going to cry uncle and never use chemical weapons again, which obviously is what the U.S. mission is designed to do, then there is a major concern or risk of hitting the wrong target, of having people be in the wrong place at the wrong time, effectively.
Richard Engel, NBC News chief foreign correspondent, joining us from Istanbul tonight. Richard, I know it's going to be a very long night and long morning for you. Thanks very much for being here, my friend.
Thank you.
On the left side of the screen there, what you're seeing is actually, and we've got it labeled there, it says Syrian State TV. This actually is our live feed of what you would be seeing in Syria right now if you were on the ground. As I said, it is 7 hours ahead of the American Eastern Time, so just coming up on 5 in the morning in Syria right now. Syrian State TV has broken into programming. You see they're showing the night sky. Obviously, they're watching for missile strikes, bombs, other explosions. They've reported tonight that Syrian air defense forces have launched, quote, counterstrikes against the American, French, and British aggression on Syria. As Keir Simmons was explaining, Syria does actually have fairly sophisticated air defense system. They've got the S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, both of which are Russian systems. Some of those are manned by Syrian military personnel. Others are manned by Russian military personnel. In the case of the Russian air defenses, those are there purportedly to defend significant numbers of Russian personnel who are in uniform in Syria. And as Richard was just explaining, there's also significant numbers of Russian personnel who are not in uniform in Syria, which also complicates the geopolitical picture here. As U.S. and French and British forces launched these strikes tonight, obviously the intent, as voiced by France and the U.K. and the United States, is to hit the Assad regime in response to it using chemical weapons against its own people again. But when you start launching kinetic strikes inside a place as complicated as Syria is right now, you are potentially engaging Russian targets, Iranian targets, Turkish targets, Kurdish targets, American allied targets, Syrian defense forces. Ayman Mohaldin, NBC reporter, is reporting tonight that a Syrian opposition figure has said that 4 different cities have been hit so far in these strikes. The initial reports we got were from Reuters that explosions had been heard on the eastern side of Damascus. Richard just reported moments ago, Richard Engel reported that 2 locations were thought to have been hit on the outskirts of Damascus. We are still getting piece by piece information. Cal Perry is NBC News global editor of digital content, and as far as I understand it, Cal is actually just off the phone with somebody in Syria who we believe is an eyewitness to what's been happening thus far since these strikes have happened. Cal, thank you very much for joining us tonight. What can you tell us that you've been able to learn this evening?
So, Rachel, I'm talking to somebody in western Damascus. He's huddled with his family. He's a journalist. I'm marrying together what he's telling me with what Ayman is telling me and what we're hearing from Syrian opposition groups. They're confirming 3 sites in and around Damascus have been hit at this hour. I'm going to walk you through the 3 of them because they give us a very clear picture that this is different than what we saw a year ago, that the United States military, looks as though they're targeting command and control facilities and specifically chemical weapons facilities. The first location is the Meza Air Base. That's in the southern part of Damascus. Very large air base, dozens of hangars there. That would be a command and control facility. The second location is in Jamraya. That is in sort of the northern part of the city. It appears as though this was a Special Forces Republican Guard command and control facility. Again, I want to stress, in keeping with what Keir said, in keeping with what Richard said, there's been a lot of time to clear out these facilities. But again, these are the facilities we're hearing that were hit. The third facility is in Barza in eastern Syria. This is a known facility by the OPCW. It is what the Syrian government has called a, quote, scientific research facility. that is code for a place where chemical weapons are made by the Syrian government. Those 3 sites were pummeled about 35 minutes ago. There were 8 explosions in Damascus, a series of explosions. There was about 20 minutes of quiet and then loud bangs that we believe are being now associated with those surface-to-air defense batteries that the Syrians have. They call them the S-300 batteries. So about 20 minutes of gap between the incoming American fire and outgoing Syrian fire, Rachel.
Okay, Cal, thank you very much. And we are piecing together from the various sources of information that we can get, both eyewitnesses, like Cal was talking to there, an eyewitness in Damascus, in western Damascus, a journalist he was able to get on the phone, also reports from news services. And I should tell you that in less than 10 minutes, we are expecting to get a briefing from the U.S. military, from the Defense Department at the Pentagon. If past is any prologue, we expect that we will get significantly more detailed information about what exactly the U.S. military is doing tonight, along with the French and the British, than what we got from the president. The president, in his remarks at the top of the hour, essentially describing the aims of these strikes, describing this as a sustained effort, and as Richard pointed out, essentially an open-ended effort rather than a one-off strike like we saw from this president 1 year ago. But we expect at the top of the hour to get more detailed information from the Pentagon. I also want to now go to Beirut, to Lebanon, where Bill Neely, a chief global correspondent for NBC News, has hopefully a little more information that he can give us in terms of what we're learning about targeting and the overall aims of these strikes. Bill Neely, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, good evening, Rachel. The very latest that we're hearing from Syrian television is that the Syrians are claiming that they have downed 13 incoming missiles. That's not obviously confirmed by NBC News, but that's what the Syrian regime is reporting. We know there are 21 air bases in Syria that are controlled by the regime. They have about 260 warplanes, more than 80 helicopters. At this point, we don't know whether those aircraft have been targeted. But remember, the aim is to destroy the chemical weapons capability of Syria. So those are the aircraft that deliver the chemical weapons, so one might presume that those are being targeted. Now, I know Damascus very well. I've been there about a dozen times, and I've been monitoring social media and indeed reports by Reuters and the Agence France Presse news agency, and they are reporting significant strikes in 3 areas in particular, to the north, to the east, and the south of Damascus. And indeed, one trusted source has told me that this is the largest ever series of airstrikes on Damascus. Those 3 targets are a research center called Jamraya, which is north of Damascus. It's thought that it is a place where chemical weapons and non-conventional weapons and missiles are developed, and indeed it was hit by the Israeli Air Force earlier this year and on at least one other occasion. A second target east of Damascus is the Dumer Air Base. Now, why that's significant is it's thought that that was the air base from which the helicopters took off last weekend to drop those chemical weapons on the suburb of Damascus, on Douma. And the third significant target, and again, this is backed up by what I'm seeing on social media, some people posting videos, some people posting audio of Syrian air defenses engaging incoming missiles. The third site is an airbase south of Damascus called Mezeh. It's used by Bashar al-Assad's elite Republican Guard. So President Trump talked about precision airstrikes. It would seem, from what we're hearing from trusted sources in Damascus, that those are indeed precision strikes on significant chemical weapons facilities and on air bases. But of course, Rachel, you know, one question is how long these strikes will last, and it would seem that there are waves of airstrikes. We've had about nearly an hour of airstrikes. One was reported just about 5 minutes ago. But, you know, in the long term, this doesn't really change the calculus or the course of the war. After these airstrikes, President Assad will still be in power. The war will be as complicated, obviously, if not more complicated than it was. So for President Trump, the question is, you know, airstrikes do not do not equal a strategy. So what comes next? Will he follow through with what he hinted a while back, that he would pull those 2,000 US troops out of eastern Syria, or is he here for the medium or the long haul? That is the strategic question that must follow tonight's tactical airstrikes. Rachel?
Bill Neely joining us live from Beirut tonight. Bill, invaluable. Thank you very much for being with us. I want to tell you at home that we are just a couple of minutes away from what you expect to be a Pentagon briefing, which is likely to be at least, again, if past is prologue, it's likely to be more detailed in terms of what's exactly happening right now in the skies above and on the ground in Syria. Andrea Mitchell is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. She joins us now by phone. Andrea, is it your expectation that we will get further detail about both the aims and the scale of what's underway tonight?
Yes, I think precisely that. One of the important issues will be, did Jim Mattis win the argument, the defense secretary arguing for a more limited approach, worried about a wider war, or is it the John Bolton approach? We understand there was quite a debate over this policy that may have been part of the reason why they waited a number of days. It also could have been communicating to the Russians to try to avoid direct hits on Russian bases, Russian activity, as we understood the regime, the Syrian regime, moving equipment and personnel into Russian areas to sort of use them as Russian shields, if you will. Very big concern about avoiding a wider war in the Pentagon. There's another concern as well, is an asymmetric response from the very sophisticated Russian and Iranian cyber capability, offensive capability, and it could be a cyber hit that the NSA is not for. So the cyber command based in Fort Meade has also been geared up, trying to, see if anything, any incoming from the cyber possibilities. State Department has been pretty detached from all of this. The acting Secretary of State, John Sullivan, is in Peru, where he was on the mission with the Vice President. He joined the Deputy's National Security meeting by teleconference and phone, but the fact is that he has not been in the country. He's out of the country. We don't have a Secretary of State, and there's a division in the Senate as to whether Mike Pompeo is going to get an easy confirmation because of a lot of dissatisfaction on the Democratic side. And you have Rand Paul already vowing on the Republican side to vote against him. Just earlier today, I was in New York and interviewing Kirsten Gillibrand, and she was against military action, as she's a member of the Armed Services Committee, because there has not been an authorization of military force since right after 9/11.
Of course.
And there's a expanding contingent of Democrats like Tim Kaine, Chris